That's a good sign. Hey there, my name is Renee Hobbs, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Across the Generations. All this fall semester, we've been exploring what media literacy looks like and sounds like, and what are the unique challenges and opportunities of doing media literacy across the lifespan. And just to give you a sense of where we're at with this program, let me see if I can find myself to the right page here. Here's the whole story of where we're at and where we're going. It's sorry, I should have done a little bit better job with this. Across the generations, ACROSS, across-generations. Click on this link and you'll see exactly where we're going. There's the, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, I guess you can see that. This is a link that shows the whole trajectory of our work together this fall. We started with Faith Rogo, who helped us understand media literacy in the context of preschool education, and we realized that building blocks of media literacy concepts are developed in preschool. Then came Kristen Zimke, who helped us understand how young people's natural curiosity and their ability to learn can be activated in ways that support media literacy competencies. A couple of weeks ago, we heard from Troy Hicks, and he demonstrated for us a way for us to manage the complicated developmental challenge of the tween middle school years, fitting out and standing in. And today we feature Adam Maksl as he helps us think about the civic media literacy competencies that are really engaged during the high school years. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what's coming up next, because if you would like to participate in the program in January that kicks off on January 17th with Teresa Redmond talking about media literacy in college, and then Alicia Haywood, who's going to talk about media literacy for parents, and then I'm going to talk about media literacy for older people. And then our friend Pavi Rossi is going to talk about media literacy for seniors. And we're going to conclude the program on March 14th with Yanti talking about intergenerational dialogue. If you want to do any of those things, and we really hope you do, guess what? There's a new link you have to click. It's right here. I'm going to put this link in the chat because I'm hoping that you guys are going to want to sign up for the next round. But just because of the way Zoom is, it does require another click. It does require another click. Yes, it does. So that's the reality. And I hope you, I hope you take the opportunity to make that, click on that link, because this conversation has gotten deeper and deeper as we go. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, you know that the way this works is that we usually start with a little bit of an emotional check-in. Then our presenter shares with us some ideas and content, and then we break into a small group discussion for about 15 minutes where you'll get an opportunity to make a new friend, to see an old friend, and basically make connections between the ideas you encountered in this session and your life and professional experience. Then we come back for the end, we raise new questions, we try to do some synthesis, and we wave goodbye. And we like to start on time and we like to end on time. So let's just do the simplest of all possible media literacy check-ins. It looks like this. It's called The 7 Ages of Man. Give me a thumbs up if you can see the 7 Ages of Man on your screen right now. It's an annotation activity, or in the chat. Which one of these 7 ages of men captures your mood at this very moment in time? Which of these is where you're at right now? If you'd like, use the Zoom annotation tool and identify it. I am feeling a little sneezy. So I circled sneezy because it's not COVID, but it's something. That's where I'm feeling today. Take a minute and annotate the screen. Tell me which one of these 7 ages of man captures where you're at, or open up the chat and tell me why. I see some sleepies and some happies. Well, I'll hear from 3 of you. Open up your microphone. Tell me, which one did you choose and why? Don't make me call on you. Which one of these most fits your mood right now and why? Zan. Catherine.
I'll go.
I got it.
I'm feeling slightly sleepy, but more dopey right now because I'm getting over the flu. So my head is still recovering.
Sorry
but I'm glad to be here.
And it gives me something to look forward to. After my sneezy, I'll get dopey. Great. Who's next?
I'll go.
Thanks.
I'm happy because I'm happy I remembered that this was happening, and yeah, it's so good to be here with y'all.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah.
We're seeing you're recovering, and we're happy you're here. And let's see who else is going to tell me where you're at right now. Which of these fits your mood right now? Open up your microphone.
Hey, I'll go.
Call on you.
I'll go from Colorado. I'm Wade, and I'm happy because I'm always happy.
Nice. That's why we're glad you're part of the Media Education Lab community, Wade. And thank you to everyone who reflected a little bit on it. We have a lot in common, whether we're sleepy, happy, dopey, bashful, doc, sneezy, or grumpy. We're come as you are. Come as you are. To the Media Education Lab, but your showing up means a great deal to our learning community. And we're so happy that you're part of this community. We just want to acknowledge that. Okay, I'm going to clear all the drawings. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to turn it over to Adam Maksl. Adam, I can't even remember how long I've known you, but it seems like I've known you for my whole life. And your engagement in the media literacy community, and especially your expertise in news literacy, has been a source of great learning to me over the last at least 5 or 7, or maybe has it been 10 years? I don't know. So take it away, introduce yourself, and tell us what you have to share with us about media literacy during high school years when it comes to civic education.
Well, Renee, thank you for inviting me to chat with this wonderful program. This is just when you sent that email out a few months ago to say, let's really talk about this across the generations. It was amazing because there's so much opportunity also for that intergenerational sort of thinking. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, for those of you who were sleepy, I hope that I don't put you to sleep in this presentation. But anyway. So you all can share you all can see my screen. I hope. Yes. Yeah. So okay. Well, so let me tell you a little bit about me. So, as Renee mentioned, I've done a lot of work in news literacy. I'm a journalism professor at Indiana University Southeast, but this area of high schools is actually near and dear to my heart because that's actually why I got into studying all of this to begin with. So years ago I was studied secondary education, taught briefly high school journalism, and then I worked for a number of years and still do some work in this area, running outreach programs for high school journalism students and teachers. And the more and more, always the conversations that we had, even before people talked about news literacy or media literacy, certainly before people talked about news literacy, this is really what so much of high school journalism has been about for a long time. And certainly now the ability to create and really sort of dig down into the critical process of creation has been made so much easier with technology over the last few years. So what I want to present today is, I say from the 5 C's to civics, right? So we think about high school as a really good opportunity, this sort of bridge between adolescence and starting into sort of young adulthood, where there's an opportunity to engage more with the world around us, with civil society, and how does information, media, news really provide a necessary tool to do that, but also a overwhelming tool as well. So I'll kind of frame this discussion around news literacy, but I do want to sort of start to say, as Renee knows, I tend to sort of not get super. There are distinctions between different literacies, but there's a lot more that these have in common. In fact, you'll notice my background has a little logo in one of these. I think this corner, which is the digital DGI, which is a program that I run. That I co-directed at Indiana University. In fact, at least two of our fellows, at least two of them are part of this call. I saw Pamela Morris and Paul Cook earlier. And this is a program we run across Indiana University to really promote digital. We'll use sort of the umbrella term of digital literacy to our faculty across disciplines, across ranks, across campuses, but really as a place to, for all these kinds of literacies to come together. And we sort of went with the gardening metaphor because there's lots of different plants in a garden. So that's kind of how I really approach the idea of different literacies that we sort of talk about in this space. But I'll use the term news literacy quite a bit, but I'll kind of remind you that I sort of take that broader approach. So, first I want to give a sort of a shout out to my previous presenters, because I think that they provide a really good foundation upon which we can start to talk about the high school age and the civics that we can start to engage students with. So, with Faith talking about just introducing students to that concept of media are constructed, right? Telling, these young people, young children, 3 to 6 years old, media aren't natural. They don't exist, that we just collect them. Media are made. People are behind that, and they do it for a reason. And those reasons influence others. Their choices influence others, whether they intended to or not. And just introducing sort of students or young people to that is really, really powerful. Moving on to Kristen, talking about sort of media literacy to elementary age students. One of the great stories, I have a 7-year-old, so this is really relevant to me, looking at stories about sharks and snakes and why are they always portrayed as so mean and ferocious? And as a parent of a 7-year-old who likes to read animal battle books to him, that kind of thing can really influence. And now if they see snakes or sharks in the wild, they might get an inaccurate perception, right? But starting to introduce and challenge students and getting them to sort of question and participate in that inquiry is a really important part of elementary. And then moving into Troy, really challenging us to think about how middle schoolers and those middle grades are beginning to produce content and what we can do as educators to help them interact and really think about the media choices that they're making as creators. There's a slide that Troy had used in his presentation, and I'm going to use part of that as well if I can advance. There we go. So he had shared this infographic here on the right side from Common Sense, talking about, yes, young people engage in media production, but a lot of what they do is consumption. In fact, a lot of what most of us do is consumption. Now, I think that certainly it's important to recognize that consumption and production in an interconnected, interactive media landscape, there's not always sort of a clear delineation between the two. Certainly there are cases where something is clearly production and clearly consumption. But even when we think about our typical consumption patterns, right, there are elements of production or sharing within that, right? When we share, there's an element of production there. When I like something, there's an element because it's changing how that piece of media is viewed by others. In fact, that act of liking or sharing can actually influence and does influence how information is circulated, which is an element of media and news literacy as well. So I wanted to use this as sort of the jumping off point where I really talk about the necessary elements, the necessary and insufficient elements that are needed to help prepare students in young people and high schoolers in particular to start to interact sort of in more civically oriented, civic literacy behaviors, we might call them. So like any good educational program, we always sort of start with outcomes. So I want to do that just briefly. So I'm going to ask you, and we're going to talk about civic literacy. What is it? What are we really talking about? If we're talking about behaviors, which is, I think, generally what we talk about, what are those behaviors? As we've seen in the last certainly half decade, or so, a huge increase in the interest around all of these literacies, in the important value that these literacies normatively play for democracy, right? Many of us on this call are scholars, are teachers, are certainly interested in this stuff, and there's been an increased interest over the last half decade or so, especially. And there's that suggestion that there's a connection between teaching young people or others as well across the lifespan about the structure of media, asking those critical questions, engaging them in media production, helps them become more engaged members of civil society. So what does that mean? So I wanted to challenge us to think about that. I want to introduce you to this concept of the 5 C's of news literacy. And again, remember, I'm using news literacy, but have a fairly broad definition of news, which I'll share in a minute. And I want to really challenge us when we're talking through in these breakouts. What are some pedagogical strategies that we can use to really emphasize these 5 C's, the skills and competencies around them? So first, when we think about this age group in particular, because a lot of what I talk about can be applied and certainly is applied at other elements of the lifespan. Certainly, I think you can see that throughout all of the presentations. But high school environment provides some opportunity and some challenges to really engaging in this conversation about civics. Certainly, we see more civic education opportunities. There's more exposure to classes in high schools around government, or in some cases even just civics. There's more opportunity to incorporate news and current events, and there's more interest in the outside world. So there becomes an opportunity there. If we look at sort of each of these sort of areas on a horizontal sort of 2 different rows, right? There's an opportunity for civics. Let's see. There's an opportunity for civic education, more of it, right? We start to see sort of students and young people start to develop more of a political identity. But we also have a polarized political environment that makes sometimes that discussions really challenging, right? And in some cases can be like the third rail, is something that we don't even want to touch. So it can be a challenge. Likewise, sort of on this row here, right, there's more exposure to current events. There's more exposure and accessibility to tools and technologies that can help young people express themselves. But there's also an increased desire for censorship and control that comes from adults, that comes from systems. My dissertation was actually about self-censorship of the high school student press, and looking at what factors, what policies can actually help to create a sort of negative culture around self-censorship, right? So that notion, does censorship in a high school student media environment really lead to self-censorship? And a lot of times the source of that self-censorship can be not wanting to get people I care about in trouble, right? So even sometimes what we don't say can say a lot to students about the decisions that they make about what they share, which I think is an important opportunity for us to include news and media and civic literacies into our curriculum. So first, before we go on, I'm going to open up my chat here so I can see some of your responses. I want to take just a minute, and I want you to think about, when we think about these behaviors, when we think about civic education, what does it mean? What do we want people to do? Thinking about the behaviors, what do we actually think media education can help promote? And so just take 15, 20 seconds, think about it, and then pop your answer in the chat. So, evidence-based outcomes and informed citizenry. Vote in all caps there. Engage activism. Jonah, I'm curious if you want to unmute. What do you mean by engage activism?
Hopefully, I think proper media literacy empowers students to recognize what they feel is wrong about the world and to act on the world, not just to passively consume information about the world.
Yeah. There's an element of act. You mentioned active and passive, right? So media consumption we often think of as passive, but can be active, and that can really lead to that ability to and the desire to want to be more engaged civically. So, Renee, are you seeing any others we want to highlight here?
Oh, I'm having way too much fun chatting in the chat.
Oh.
This is a very rich discourse going on in the chat about it. I want to call out Scott Spicer around this idea of being able to see things from multiple points of view. It seems like that's a really cool aspect of civic education.
Thank you. Am I supposed to say something?
You can.
Yeah, I mean, everything I do is just about in my classes at the university level is multi-perspectival. It's a requirement. Renee really hammered that into me, but thanks, Renee. No, I think that's important. It's one of the aspects that we can do when we're talking about student created media is that we force them in one way or another somewhere in the curriculum to be exposed to multiple perspectives and to wrestle with that kind of complexity intentionally. In that way, you can cover the various biases that exist within the classroom. And I do a lot of intentional curriculum mapping to ensure that we get that curriculum is multi-perspectival.
Scott mentioned a word that I think is a good segue to a couple other points is the complexity, right? Media are complex, right? And the structures in which media are created and circulated and consumed are complex. And in having exposure to in knowledge of that complexity helps us engage in behaviors that help recognize the complexity and also connect to sort of the complexity of other civil activities, right? Like all of these that we're mentioning in chat. All right. Well, so I want to introduce you to this concept of news literacy behaviors. Now, I hope not to get too eggheady, and if I do, someone digitally throw something at me. I don't know. So I mentioned in my work, and this is reflective of a lot of work that I've done with a couple of colleagues who Renee and many of you might know, Seth Ashley at Boise State, Melissa Tully at the University of Iowa, Emily Vraga at the University of Minnesota, and Stephanie Kraft at the University of Illinois. We've really worked to try to create a more structured definition of news literacy that can go beyond sort of a protectionist approach that really orients around just, hey, believe the traditional media organization, because that actually gives the traditional media organization kind of a pass, right? It doesn't talk about the structural biases that are inherent in media organizations. There are necessary heuristics. We need to be able, there's more media, there's more information, there's not more time, but at the same time, understanding the structure helps us develop those heuristics, right? If I know about the commercial structure of media or the processes that media creators go through, that helps me create heuristics or shortcuts that mean that I don't have to analyze individually every single thing that comes across, my phone or my computer. So anyway, so we take a broad definition of news: any accurate information that facilitates decision making on both personal or social issues, right? So, a librarian might say, "This is really information literacy." Okay, I think it differs in some ways to some other elements of media literacy, because media literacy can also be applied to, non-accurate or advertising or fiction or things like that. Also, there are, now that's not to say that there aren't truths and information embedded in those media constructions. Of course, there are, but we tried to sort of define a smaller part of this space, still broad. When we think about news literacy, we define it as both knowledge of personal and social processes, right? Because it's not just about what I do or what individuals do, but it's also about the social processes in which individuals are in. And how does that influence how news and information is produced, distributed, consumed, and also about the skills that try to give us some control over that, right? Because part of this is about media literacy is about empowerment and developing agency around the influence that media can have on our lives. So here's my eggheady model. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but essentially, when we think about think about reading, right? I can read. I can know about reading. I can have the skills to read, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to sit down and read a book, right? There are a lot of other factors that influence it, like my attitudes towards reading, or what are people around me doing, and what do I think people around me should be doing, and what control do I have? Maybe I don't have enough time to read, right? So, think about, things around news literacy, verification, but also civic literacy behaviors too. News literacy can be one part, which again, the skills and knowledge can be one part that can influence, this factor. Again, going back to what Scott had said, it's complex, right? When we look at this just news literacy component, this is where I think that we can have some opportunity to really start to build conversations with high school students. And it's around these personal and social processes by which news is produced, distributed, and consumed, right? So these are the 5 C's of news literacy: content creation, context creation, content circulation, and consumption. Each of these really, when we think about the personal and social processes that influence news, they're going to fit into one, sometimes more than one of these spaces that interact with one another. Now, some of this comes from some other scholarship that I've used when I'm talking to high school students and college students, or at least not explicitly, but it's sort of underlying what I talk about with them, which is the notion of influence is hierarchical, right? When someone says, "Oh, that journalist posted that article because they're a liberal, and most journalists are liberal, therefore all journalism is liberally biased," that assumes that journalists have like complete and uninterrupted agency to do anything that they want, which isn't true, right? They exist within routines that they do within an organization. That organization interacts with other organizations, and ultimately it's in a culture, right? I usually tell use the example of my students to say, if you were a baker and you're a super huge liberal and you're in a really conservative area, are you going to bake cookies that say, that advocate for your candidate? And of course, the students will say, well, of course not. You want to sell cookies? Yes. So, that there are these structures. There's, commercial biases or biases are around, things that kind of tell a nice, neat story, are that relate to, recency, something that happened, yesterday is more newsworthy, generally in the routines that journalists and other media creators use, and something that happened a long time ago. Or expediency, the idea that if I have 10 stories to write and I call 5 sources, and Renee's the best source for my story, but she doesn't call me back, I'm going to use the source that calls me back, right? Because I have, I want to go home, right? So all these sort of elements that are actually part of just life and other kinds of work as well, that we can start to introduce people to. So the work that we've done sort of is based on some of this past work. So we'll talk about each of these 5 C's and give you some time to go into breakouts and talk about this. So context, what's that social, legal, and economic environment that news is created? We'll talk a lot about this. Advertising, where and I know we have people from all over the world on this call. Much of media certainly in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world are for-profit businesses. That has an impact, right? Attention and advertising become the core economic model, so that's what's sold, right? We're not, if we're not paying for something, we're the product, right? That sort of element of it. There's regulatory frameworks, that understanding that regulatory framework is important, but also skills related to this, right? The context includes things like terms of service. Do I have the ability to read through a terms of service and understand the constraints that I'm in or that others are in? Is an example of that, right? Let me. So the notion of creation, right? The process of the journalists and others are engaging in conceiving, reporting, and creating news. By the way, this isn't just the interesting thing about several of these pieces. It's not just human actors, non-human actors too, right? So I've been playing a lot with GPT lately, right? And that's, I think, something that is an interesting element to think about with all of this. What are the backgrounds of media creators? That has an impact. The norms and routines. And this can be used, by the way, not just with news, but even other kinds of information. So, for example, if we're looking at recent peer-reviewed articles, we know that the pandemic has had a huge effect on the process of peer review in scholarship. So when we're having students to go find peer review articles for a research paper, and when they're in high school, thinking through structural biases exist there as well, right? So how do we also sort of engage people in high school students in the process of media creation as well, and an important part of a lot of media literacy work. Content, understanding sort of common content frames. What are those characteristics, right? Knowing that lots of election stories are just horse races, right? And knowing enough to be able to maybe differentiate that from other content is a core element of the knowledge and skills. Circulation, again, this is one of those that also sort of includes both human and non-human actors. But what are those processes? How does my behavior affect what I see on social media? What are those processes that are stopping or letting information sort of pass along? And how do we have power over this, right? Can I customize? Do I have the ability, the skill to customize the effect of social media sites and the information that I get? And ultimately consumption, right? The knowledge of one's own personal biases or predispositions, and recognizing that while there is a common language that we have when we all sort of look at media, when there is so much media in particular, or even if we're looking at the same thing for that matter, our own experiences, our own biases introduce differentiations in how we process and make meaning of that. Now, I go back to my sort of eggheady thing earlier, and I said, that's news literacy that I just talked about. What about these other things, right? Attitudes, social norms, perceived control. These are elements that influence those behaviors, those news literacy or civic literacy behaviors. What are the opportunities and challenges when we think about high school students, right? Peer influences, certainly, right? Social norms can kind of go one way or the other, right? So understanding what do young people think that they should be doing, or what do they think their peers are doing? That's going to influence this. Certainly, controls of information, where we see censorship or self-censor and leading to self-censorship. For example, in high school media, and certainly, political polarization, creates a substantial challenge as well. So, this is the big question, right? This is I mentioned the one of my favorite quotes. There's two things you don't want to know how are made, right? You all know the quote, the saying, right? What are the two things? Anybody? Put them in chat. Laws and sausages. All right. In journalism too, right? So, but that's right. Yeah. So journalism is journalism or media, right? There's it's easy to become cynical, right? It's so complex, right? There's so many things. How can I ever have any control over any of this, right? And I think that the connection to like food is an interesting one, right? Because the food ecosystem is really complex, right? And there are a lot of ways that understanding more about the food ecosystem allows me to make better choices about my diet. And I think that's, you don't have to know everything about everything, right? But even introducing knowledge and skills into small parts of the ecosystem helps us better you know choose the pieces that we need to again engage in those civic literacy behaviors without having being cynical or having our mind explode. So so what I want to do is I want to move into the breakouts and have a little discussion. So I have some and I'll put these links in the chat in just a moment. But I'll put a link to my presentation, so there's some examples there that I didn't talk about, as well as the activity. What I want us to engage in these questions. For each of these C's, what knowledge or skills are especially relevant to high school students? And how can we integrate these into our curriculum and our work with teens? So not just folks who are teachers, but others as well. How do we address these influences of civic behaviors like the attitudes and norms of perceived control when we talk about civic literacy? And ultimately, how do we do all this without becoming cynical? So these are the questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can put these links in the chat. Does anybody have any questions, or what questions do you have about the activity?
Okay, so you Adam's going to put those questions into the meeting chat, so you have them when you break into small group. You're going to be in a room with 4 or 5 other people. Take a minute to introduce yourself to each other, because this is a networking opportunity. And maybe you're going to be in a room with somebody you know, or maybe it's a group of people you haven't met before, but this is a great networking opportunity. So make sure you take time to introduce yourselves to each other. And then there's always somebody who's going to keep that conversation on track. We'd like you to address one or more of the questions. We're going to take about 15 minutes in the small group. And then when we come back, we're going to ask you to reflect on the ideas and insights that were most meaningful to you. So we'll try to do some synthesis at the end. Thumbs up if you understand the purpose of the breakout room and what's going to happen in the breakout room. And listen, if you're in a room all by yourself, don't just sit there and be lonely. Come back to the main room and we'll reassign you. Okay, that happens sometimes. So don't just wait for people to show up. Come back and we'll reassign you. Rooms are open. Make a new friend and have a great conversation. $45 people, 10 rooms. That's pretty good, Adam.
Yeah.
So now, because you're co-host, you can see how you can go join in any room you want. You can lurk in the back. You can hang here and just chat with whoever comes in. I'll be joining a room, but then I'll be monitoring the main room. 1238, 48, 4850. So we'll come back at 5 minutes, well, 5 or 6 minutes before the hour. So it'll be a tight synthesis. We'll hear from 2 people, maybe, or 3, and then you will get the last word.
Sounds good.
Remember, people only remember the first thing you say and the last thing you say. So just keep that in mind.
So, well, I'm going to jump around to some rooms here and there.
Go for it. Cool. I'll see you
All
back in about, 15, 12 minutes or so. All right, here. Let's see, which room am I going to go to? Okay, that is my favorite part of a Zoom meeting, when you watch everybody come back into the room. Give me a thumbs up if you had a good conversation. Did you have a good conversation? I sure hope you did. We're going to take just a few minutes to hear from a couple of you. Unmute your microphone. We're trying to do some synthesis. What was a big idea, an insight, or something that you think everybody in the group needs to hear as you try to identify some key ideas that emerged?
Well, I'll go because Nancy Jennings and I were pretty much in a group together, and we run the continuum from me with the boots on the ground, and she is a professor of journalism. And what we're seeing is all of these missed stops along the way. It's we kind of feel like it's that TGV in France, where you go from Paris to Avignon and there are no stops, and there's no way to get the kids to plug in on all of the 5 C's, and I've tried entering at all of those different points. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Abel. It is a fast moving train. Thanks for sharing. Who's next? What was an insight that came up that you think you want to synthesize for us? Scott.
Well, Jocelyn and Mark from this NGO who works with Ukrainian media literacy were just absolutely brilliant and heartwarming in their description of how you can infuse media literacy, and even to people who are even in the most dire of circumstances. And up until today, I kind of had assumptions that media literacy was frankly a privileged kind of endeavor in some ways. You need to have the mental space. And we talked a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy and where do you need to be in order to really wrestle with the complexities of media when you're dealing with life circumstances. And I applied that to domestic situations where a lot of our students are living in less than ideal conditions. And at what level can we break through media literacy and those to folks who don't have that kind of privilege? So anyways, that
Awesome.
There's a lot there there's a lot. I love those people.
Wonderful. It is an amazing conversation, but there's one more person out there who wants to do a little bit of synthesis. What happened in your room? Some idea that was important that you think needs to be said. Teresa.
Well, I had the opportunity to meet John and Vamsi, and John shared his interest in Fiskit, his work with Fiskit, which is it sounds like an annotation tool for students to annotate news articles, but they identify issues. They identify straw man arguments or bias or opinions, etc. And then students can engage in a second round of this kind of annotating their peers' comments. So we got around to this idea of literacy as a social practice and of empowering students to be in the driver's seat, and how that really avoids the cynicism because they are so actively engaged and empowered.
Oh my God, what a perfect way to end up. But Adam, you get the last word, my friend, because you were the guy who inspired us to have these great conversations.
Well, I think that point, Teresa, your group, mentioning that notion of the social process, right? That, as we've talked about, there is more information, there's more news, there's more media than ever, and it's overwhelming, and there's not more time, right? Which is why saying everyone needs to be a fact checker. We just need to go through and you need to parallel read. Those are all important skills, but we don't have more time in the day to do it, right? And especially when we are facing the complexities or the needs that of all the things in our life, as Scott was mentioning, right? So how do we think about this going forward, right?
Oh, wait. It's so perfect, Adam. It's so perfect. You know the old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And the metaphor for that is related to exactly why you showed up at this Across the Generations program, why you chose to take an hour of your day to spend time as a social learner with us, and why you contributed your thoughts in ways that have inspired all of us. Adam, I want to give you a big round of applause. Adam, thank you for leading our discussion today. And listen, we always like to start on time and end on time. So I'm going to just remind you, we're going to meet next time for the Media Literacy Conference being organized by Iglika Ivanova and Michelle Ticcioni. And hopefully you'll join us for this marvelous 2-day conference, January 13th and 14th. And then Teresa Redmond, you're leading us in a session on January 17th called Media Literacy Goes to College. But just a reminder, you guys will not get the memo unless you click on this link in the chat to register, because January means a new registration process. So take a minute and register to join us for the January program. And in the meantime, I hope to see you online, but thank you for being part of this. I'm Renee Hobbs at the Media Education Lab. You guys rock. Have a great holiday break, and we'll see you in January. Bye.
Bye.